An old photograph revealed a hidden bond between Lucia and Clara's husband. But when the truth came to light, Clara discovered that her family's secrets were just the beginning of a story that could change everything. Clara was carefully putting away Lucia's last clothes in the wardrobe. The nanny had been working for the family for months and had always been impeccable in her role. But that day, while she was going through the drawers to organize them better, she found something unexpected. At the bottom of a drawer, almost hidden under a lace handkerchief, there was an old photograph. Clara's heart raced. She gently slipped the photo between her fingers and looked at it closely. The image showed a young Marcos, her husband, many years younger, with a relaxed and smiling expression. But what caught her attention most was the presence of another person, Lucia. The woman in the photo was undoubtedly her, although she looked different, younger and dressed simply, with her hair tied back and a peculiar sparkle in her eyes. The scene seemed too intimate. The closeness between the two in the photograph was evident, as if they shared a bond that went far beyond the professional. "What's this doing here?" Clara muttered to herself, feeling a lump form in her throat. For a few seconds, she remained static, as if time had frozen. She tried to remember if Marcos had ever mentioned meeting Lucia before she started working at the house. But no. In her memory, Lucia had arrived recommended by an acquaintance and had integrated seamlessly into the family routine. Clara carefully put the photograph in her pocket. She looked around as if she was afraid that someone was watching her, even though she was alone in the room. She slowly closed the drawer and left the room with silent steps, feeling that something had changed inside her. A shadow of distrust was beginning to grow. As she walked down the stairs, the laughter of her children playing in the garden brought her back to reality, but it failed to dispel her thoughts. The echo of the photograph was still there, throbbing in her mind like a freshly opened wound. Clara walked into the living room, where Marcos was absent-mindedly leafing through a magazine on the couch. She watched him for a few moments, trying to find something in his expression that might give away a secret. She couldn't help but wonder how much more she might not know about the man she shared her life with. "Everything okay, love?" Marcos asked when he noticed her presence. "Yes," she replied with a tight smile. "I was just finishing organizing Lucia's things." Marcos nodded without giving it much importance and returned to his magazine. Clara pressed her lips together and decided not to confront him yet. She needed time to gather her thoughts, maybe translated from Spanish to English. onlinedoctrinslater.com. There was no logical explanation, something to dispel her doubts and calm her mind. However, an insistent voice inside her told her that this was not a simple coincidence. That night, as they went to bed, Clara glanced at Marcos out of the corner of her eye. He was sleeping peacefully, as if the world were a place free of secrets. Clara, on the other hand, stayed awake, staring at the dark ceiling of the room. The photograph was still there, in her pocket, like an invisible weight that did not let her rest. Finally, she carefully got out of bed and went to the bathroom. She pulled out the photo and studied it in the dim light. Marcos and Lucia's smiling faces seemed to stare at her, defiant, as if whispering a truth she wasn't ready to hear. "Who are you really, Lucia?" Clara whispered to the mirror. For the first time in years, she felt like her marriage was hiding a story that had never been told, and she was determined to uncover the truth. The next morning dawned with a heavy silence in the house. Clara had slept little, tossing and turning in bed, trapped between thoughts and questions. When she went down to the kitchen, the aroma of freshly made coffee did not calm her anxiety. The photograph was still there, kept in her pocket, like a weight impossible to ignore. Marcos appeared shortly after, his hair still messy and adjusting his watch on his wrist. "Good morning," he said in his usual tone, taking a cup from the cupboard. Clara watched him silently, analyzing his every move. Marcos didn't seem to suspect anything, but she felt that something in their daily routine had now become strange. She took a deep breath, searching for the right words. "Marcos, I need to talk to you," he finally said. He looked at her, confused by the serious tone of her voice. "Is something wrong?" he asked, coming closer. Clara slowly took the photograph out of her robe pocket and placed it on the table. The paper, worn by time, seemed to absorb all the light in the room. Marcos's face tensed when he saw it. For a second, just a second, something crossed his gaze. surprise, or perhaps fear. "Where did you get this?" he murmured, trying to sound calm. "That doesn't matter. The question is, why are you here with Lucia?" Clara kept her voice firm, although she felt a lump in her throat. Marcos took the photograph carefully, studied the image as if seeing it for the first time, and attempted a weak smile. "It must be a coincidence. Lucia, she probably found this photo somewhere. It doesn't mean anything." "Nothing?" Clara repeated, incredulous. "They seem pretty close. Don't tell me there's no explanation for this." Marcos left the photograph on the table and crossed his arms, a gesture that Clara recognized well. It was his way of closing the conversation. "Clara, you're taking this out of context. It's just an old photo. Lucia works with us because she was recommended, remember? None of this makes sense." "And why didn't you ever tell me you knew her?" Clara insisted, unable to contain her frustration. "Because I didn't know her," he replied, raising his voice a little. This is not important. Do you understand? Don't obsess over meaningless things." Marcos's tone, though firm, did not convince her. Clara knew him too well. There was something in his evasiveness that unsettled her. His gaze did not hold hers for long, and the trembling in his hands as he placed the photograph on the table did not go unnoticed. "Marcos, don't lie to me," Clara said in an almost cold whisper. He shook his head and headed for the kitchen door, ending the discussion abruptly. "There's nothing else to say, Clara." Clara was left alone, with the photograph in her hands. Marcos's evasiveness only fueled her doubts. A bitter feeling settled in her chest, as if a part of her life was beginning to crumble. Something was happening, and Clara was determined to find out what it was. The next few days passed with barely concealed tension. Clara tried to remain calm in front of the children and Marcos, but her thoughts consumed her. The photograph was still there, tucked away in the back of a drawer, like a silent piece of evidence awaiting answers. However, what disturbed her most now was Lucia. Since the day Clara found the photo, the nanny seemed different. She no longer smiled as naturally or held one's gaze for long. Her gestures, although subtle, revealed nervousness. Every time Clara entered the room, Lucia would start slightly, as if she were afraid of being discovered. "Lucia, is everything okay?" Clara asked her one afternoon while she washed her fold clothes in the children's room. Lucia looked up quickly, but couldn't meet her boss's gaze. "Yes, Mrs. Clara, everything is in order," he replied with a forced smile, returning his attention to the clothes. Clara crossed her arms and studied her in silence. It was the first time she had seen Lucia so restless, as if her every move was calculated. It was obvious that something was wrong, tormented her. "Thank you for your work, Lucia. You are very dedicated," Clara commented casually, testing her reaction. "I'm just doing what I have to do," Lucia replied, squeezing a t-shirt between her fingers, with more force than necessary. The silence that followed was awkward. Clara knew that Lucia sensed her change in attitude. Since that day, she had never treated her with the same confidence as before. Now every conversation between them seemed like a silent duel, where one sought answers and the other tried to hide them. Later, Clara watched them from a distance in the garden. Lucia was playing with Mateo and Camilla, helping them pick flowers and laughing with them. For a moment, Clara doubted her own suspicions. The image of Lucia as a loving and kind caregiver contrasted with the shadow in the photograph that Clara could not forget. But then something happened that brought her back to reality. As Lucia adjusted Camilla's scarf, the girl said something to her in a low voice. Lucia smiled and replied with palpable tenderness, "Of course, little one. We all have secrets." Clara felt a chill when she heard those words. Her instincts told her that they were not casual. Was Lucia talking about her relationship with Marcos? What else did that woman know that she had not said? That night, as Clara was reviewing the family calendar, she found a detail that caught her attention. A day off requested by Lucia for the following afternoon. Although she always trusted the nanny's decisions, this time she felt that there was a hidden reason. The idea tormented her until dawn. Clara decided she could no longer remain silent. She needed to discover the truth, and to do so, she had to follow Lucia, understand her behavior, and confirm whether her suspicions were real. As she settled into bed next to a sleeping Marcos, Clara made a firm decision. If Lucia was keeping a secret, she would find out, at all costs. Clara woke up with a determination that drove her to act. She could no longer ignore the signs. That photograph, those awkward silences, and Marcos's avoidance. Everything tormented her. While he left for work and the children played in the garden, Clara closed the door to the study and turned on the computer. He wrote the name of Lucia into the search engine and waited. The results were disappointing. Just abandoned social media profiles with blurry images and minimal details. It looked like someone who preferred leave no trace. Frustrated, she tried another approach. This time she searched for the name of Mark, adding words like youth and friends. After several minutes of browsing, an old post appeared, a black and white group photo. Clara quickly zoomed in and scrolled through the faces until she stopped at Mark. There he was, much younger, smiling shyly. Below the photo, comments caught her attention. One familiar name stood out, Andres Barrero. She vaguely remembered that Marcos had mentioned it once, but they hadn't spoken for years. Clara, without hesitation, looked for Andres on social media and sent him a direct message. The wait was endless, but at noon her phone vibrated. Andres had answered. "I'm not sure I can help you. Marcos and his family were always complicated. If you need details, I'm not the one to help you." Clara read the answer several times. That word complicated left her uneasy. What was Andres talking about? What did he mean by his family? Her instincts told her that there was something dark in Marcos's past, something he had tried to hide for years. With no clear answers, Clara went to Marcos's study, knowing that he sometimes kept important documents there. A slight guilt washed over her as she searched through folders and drawers, but she needed to know. After a few minutes, she found a locked drawer. She looked around and discovered a small key hidden among old books. Opening the drawer, she found a folder with old papers and some photographs. Her hands shook as she pulled one out. This time, the picture showed Marcos only, sitting in the same park as in the previous photograph. His expression was somber, distant, as if the weight of the world rested on his shoulders. At that moment, the sound of the front door startled her. She hurriedly put everything away and closed the drawer just as Marcos entered the study. "What are you doing here?" he asked in a neutral voice, but with eyes that seemed suspicious. "I was looking for a receipt you left here," Clara replied, pretending to be natural. Marcos nodded, but he didn't seem entirely convinced. Clara left the study with her heart racing. She felt she was getting closer to the truth, even though she was still surrounded by shadows. What she had found confirmed her suspicions. Lucia had not appeared by chance, and Marcos's past hid secrets that he was not willing to share. Clara watched Lucia from the study window. The nanny was waving goodbye to the children with her usual smile before leaving through the front door. It was her afternoon off, and Clara knew that that exit could be an opportunity. Since she discovered photography, every gesture Lucia made had taken on a new meaning. This time, Clara was not going to ignore it. Putting on a light coat, she left the house a few minutes later and got into her car. From there, she discreetly followed Lucia, always keeping a safe distance. The young woman walked with a determined step through the streets, oblivious to any gaze. Finally, after about 20 minutes, Lucia entered a residential area. More modest, far from the areas where I used to walk. Clara parked on the corner and waited. From her spot, she could see Lucia climbing the stairs of a small, weathered apartment building. The silence of the place, interrupted only by the sound of a distant vehicle, increased Clara's feeling of unease. Determined, she got out of the car and crossed the street. The curtains on the second floor barely moved, but it was enough for Clara to locate the correct window. Slowly, she climbed the stairs, feeling her nerves intensify with each step. When she reached the hallway, she looked for an excuse in case she was discovered, but she didn't need to. The building seemed completely deserted. He approached Lucia's half-open door with caution. From there, he could see a small, tidy room with old but well-kept furniture. Lucia was sitting on an armchair with her back to him, holding something in her hands, a photograph. Clara leaned a little closer to see her clearly. The air caught in his chest. It was another photo from the same time, and although he couldn't see all the details from his position, he recognized Marcos. The scene looked similar to the first image. A park, the light of a sunny day, and an obvious proximity between Lucia and him. "Why are you doing this?" Clara muttered so quietly that it was barely an audible thought. Lucia suddenly stood up, as if she had sensed something. Clara quickly retreated, hiding behind a column in the hallway. The door closed with a soft slam, and the echo reverberated in her ears. From her hiding place, Clara could see Lucia leaving the apartment, carefully putting the photograph away in her bag. Clara waited a few minutes before going downstairs. She looked at the closed door and felt a wave of frustration. The pieces were beginning to fit together, but answers were still missing. Why did Lucia keep those photographs? Why did she hide them in an apartment far from home? Back in the car, Clara leaned on the steering wheel and took a deep breath. Doubts continued to grow like a storm in her mind. Lucia was not just a nanny, that was clear. There was a bond between her and Marcos that no one had told her about. As the sun began to set, Clara made a decision. The next day he would confront Lucia, and this time she would accept no evasions. She needed to know the truth, even if it hurt. Dawn brought with it a heavy air. Clara had barely slept. The image of Lucia with that photograph would not leave her mind. Determined, she waited for the children to leave for school and Marcos to leave for work. It was time to confront Lucia. "Lucia, I need to talk to you," Clara said firmly, entering the kitchen where the nanny was preparing breakfast. Lucia looked up, surprised. Her hands trembled slightly as she placed a cup on the table. "Of course, Mrs. Clara. Is something wrong?" "Sit down," Clara replied, crossing her arms. Lucia obeyed, visibly uncomfortable. The silence that formed between the two was almost suffocating. Clara took out the photograph from his pocket and placed it in front of Lucia. The young woman's face immediately paled. "Do you want to explain this to me?" Clara asked, without taking her eyes off her. Lucia took the photo with trembling hands. For a moment, she seemed to be looking for an excuse, some easy way out. But when she saw Clara's implacable gaze, she realized that she couldn't keep hiding it. His voice was barely a whisper. "I didn't want him to find out like that." "Find out what?" Clara insisted, her patience wearing thin. Lucia closed her eyes and took a deep breath, as if gathering courage. Finally, she spoke. "Marcos is my brother. I am your sister, Clara." The words hung in the air, reverberating like an endless echo. Clara felt the ground beneath her feet disappear. "What are you saying?" she managed to murmur, incredulous. "I am Marcos's father's daughter," continued Lucia with a trembling voice. "My mother was working in his house when he had an affair with her. I am the result of that mistake." Clara looked at her, unable to fully process what she was hearing. "Why did you never mention it? Why are you here?" he asked, his voice lower, almost broken. "Because he didn't know me," Lucia answered, looking away. "My mother died a few years ago, and before she passed away, she told me the truth. She showed me photos, letters, proof that Marcos is my brother, but he never knew I existed." Clara felt a lump form in her throat. "And why did you accept this job?" His voice came out, harsher than he intended. "I wanted to get close to him," Lucia answered, finally looking up. "I didn't know how to do it any other way. I saw the opportunity to work here, to get to know him, to be a part of his life, even if it was in silence. I never wanted to hurt him, Mrs. Clara. I swear it." The sincerity in his eyes disarmed Clara for a moment. There was no malice in his voice, only a deep sadness, that of someone who had lived in the shadows all his life. Clara stood up and started walking around the kitchen, trying to process everything. The betrayal she felt wasn't just for Lucia, but also for Marcos, who probably knew more than he was letting on. "Does Marcos know?" he finally asked. Lucia shook her head. "Not really. He suspects something, but I never confirmed it to him. I was afraid he would reject me, that I would lose the only connection I have left with him." Clara leaned back in a chair, feeling the weight of the revelation fall on her. Everything was starting to make sense. The photos, the nervous gestures, Lucia's glances. "This changes everything," Clara murmured, almost to herself. Lucia lowered her head, unshed tears shining in her eyes. "Forgive me, Mrs. Clara. I never wanted to be a burden or bring problems to your family." Clara did not answer. In her mind, only one idea prevailed. Marcos had lied, and now I had to face the truth. Clara waited for Marcos to return from work with a mixture of anxiety and contained anger. The afternoon had been endless since her conversation with Lucia. Every word the young woman had spoken still echoed in her mind. I am his sister. It was impossible to ignore the magnitude of that revelation. When the front door opened, Clara was sitting on the couch, arms crossed and staring out into the hallway. Marcos walked in, hanging up his coat nonchalantly, until he noticed his wife's expression. Everything okay? He asked with a hint of caution. Clara did not respond immediately. She simply took out her photograph pocket and placed it on the table in front of him. Marcos stopped dead. For the second time, that image gave him away. Lucia told me the truth, said Clara, her voice firm but trembling. I know she is your sister, Marcos. Your sister. Marcos paled. The silence that followed was almost unbearable. His gaze moved from the photo to Clara, then to nowhere in particular. He took a deep breath, as if he were gathering the courage to face the weight of that truth. Clara, he began to say, but she interrupted him. Why did you lie to me? Why did you allow this situation to escalate to this point? Her voice cracked slightly, but the anger was still there, latent. Marcos dropped into an armchair, covering his face with his hands. I didn't want you to find out like this. I never wanted this to get out of hand, he murmured, his tiredness evident. Since when do you know? Clara insisted. A few months ago, he finally answered, looking up. Lucia appeared in my life out of the blue. It wasn't a coincidence that she asked for the job here. At first I didn't understand it, but then I realized. I saw the photos she kept, and I knew it was true. She's my sister. Clara shook her head, unable to understand. Why didn't you tell me? Why hide it? We're a family, Marcos. There are no secrets between us. Because I was scared, he said almost in a whisper. Scared that you wouldn't understand, that this would complicate everything. My father, he paused, swallowing. My father made mistakes that haunt me to this day. Finding out about Lucia was like opening a wound that never healed. Clara looked at him incredulous. And you thought hiding it would solve it. All you did was make things worse. Lucia has been here all this time, living in the shadows, while you pretended that nothing was happening. Marcos ran his hand through his hair, frustrated. It's not that simple, Clara, she exclaimed, raising her voice for the first time. My father had a daughter out of wedlock, and now she's here in our house. How was I supposed to act? Clara stood up, unable to sit still. She walked to the window, seeking calm in the scenery outside. This lie is destroying us, Marcos, she said finally in a softer voice, but full of pain. Not just you, not just Lucia. All of us. Marcos fell silent, defeated. The truth had come out, but the damage had already been done. Clara looked at him one last time before leaving the room, leaving him alone with his thoughts. A thick silence hung in the air, filled with resentment and sadness. Marcos knew he couldn't go back in time, but he also understood that from that moment on, nothing would be the same. The silence in the house was as thick as a fog. After the argument the night before, Clara had barely spoken a word. Marcos, sitting across from her in the living room, looked older, as if the weight of time had finally fallen on his shoulders. You need to understand what happened, Marcos began, his voice low, almost defeated. What Lucia means to me and why I kept silent. Clara crossed her arms, her gaze still hard, but she nodded. She wasn't going to let him get away. She needed to hear the whole truth. My father was never an exemplary man, Marcos said, leaning back in the chair with his eyes lost in some point in the past. He was rigid, authoritarian, and always demanded perfection. From me, from my mother, from everyone. But over time I discovered that behind that facade, there were secrets. He paused, taking a breath as if each word cost him effort. I was 15 when my mother found out, he continued. She found hidden letters, photos, proof that my father had another family. I still remember the day she told me. She was crying inconsolably while holding those papers. It was like her whole world had fallen apart, and mine too. Clara listened in silence, her hands clenched on her knees. What happened next? He finally asked, his voice softer. Nothing, Marcos replied with a hint of bitterness. My mother decided, shut up for her. Silence was the only way to protect our family. Years later, when my father died, I tried to leave that chapter buried. I didn't want to know anymore. And Lucia? Clara asked, confused. How did you find out who she was? A few months ago, when we hired her, I noticed something strange. At first, I didn't want to believe it, but her look, her gestures, were so familiar that they made me uneasy. Then I found a photo in her things, the same photo you saw. That's when I knew it wasn't a coincidence. Marcos looked down, unable to face Clara at that moment. I confronted her, she admitted. Lucia told me her story. Her mother had revealed the truth to her before she died, and she just wanted to meet me. She wasn't after money or revenge, just to belong. But I didn't know how to handle it. I felt ashamed, Clara, ashamed of what my father had done and of not being able to face reality. Clara took a deep breath, trying to process what she had just heard. The pieces finally fit together, but the pain was still there, lingering. You lied to me, Marcos, she said, looking at him sadly. Not because of Lucia, but because you didn't trust me. You kept this to yourself, as if I couldn't understand it. I was afraid of losing you, he whispered, his voice breaking. I didn't mean to hurt you. Clara looked at him for a long moment, seeing for the first time not the strong, confident man she knew, but someone vulnerable, marked by his past. This isn't going to be solved by talking, he finally said, but I understand a little more now. Marcos nodded silently. He knew that the road to regaining Clara's trust would be long, and yet he felt a silent relief. For the first time in years, the past was no longer a secret. Dawn brought a strange silence. Clara woke up before Marcos and remained sitting on the edge of the bed, staring blankly out the window. The weight of the revelations was still with her, but a decision was beginning to take shape within her. Hours later, she found Marcos in the living room, checking emails on his phone. He barely looked up when she entered. The tension between them was palpable, but Clara couldn't let the silence destroy everything. Maher, we need to talk, he said in a firm voice. Marcos put the phone aside and nodded, as if he had been waiting for this moment. Clara sat down in front of him, took a deep breath and spoke. I want you to be honest with me, Marcos. Completely honest. We can't move forward with our marriage if we keep building it on secrets. Marcos looked at her with a mix of relief and guilt. I understand, Clara. There are no more secrets, I promise. Words aren't enough, she replied, her voice firm but calm. We have to work on this. Together, I don't want your family's past to continue ruining our present. How can we do this? He asked, genuinely concerned. We will seek help, Clara replied without hesitation. Couples therapy, whatever is necessary. But there is something else, Marcos. I want you to talk to Lucia, to give her a place in your life. It is not her fault. Marcos nodded, visibly moved. You're right, I can't ignore her anymore. She's my sister, no matter how hard it is to accept what she represents. Just then, Lucia appeared at the kitchen door, as if fate had summoned her. Noticing the seriousness of the conversation, she stopped nervously. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, he murmured. Clara stood up and walked towards her. Lucia, we need to talk about the 3 parts of this story, he said in a firm voice, but not harshly. Lucia nodded and came closer. There were tears in her eyes, but also a resigned calm. I'm going to leave, Lucia said suddenly, surprising them both. I don't want to be the cause of any more problems in this house. They need time to heal as a family. It's the right thing to do. Lucia, you don't have to, Marcos began, but she interrupted him with a soft smile. It's my decision. I'll be fine. I'll find another job, another life, but I don't want to lose contact with you, Marcos. I just wanted to have a brother. Marcos hugged her, a gesture he had been putting off for years. Clara watched them, moved but also relieved. For the first time in days, she felt the storm begin to dissipate. Thank you, Lucia, Clara said softly, for telling the truth and for giving us the time we need. Lucia smiled and walked away to pack her things. While Clara and Marcos remained alone, he looked at her with eyes full of gratitude. I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I promise I'll do whatever it takes to rebuild what I broke. Clara took her hand and squeezed it. This is not just about you, Marcos. It's about we will achieve this, step by step. They both knew the road would be long and difficult, but at that moment, for the first time in weeks, they felt a spark of hope. Broken trust could be rebuilt. Love, after all, was still there. The house had a different atmosphere since Lucia's departure. The silence, which had been heavy and tense before, now seemed like a space where something new could grow. Clara watched from the window as Marcos played with the children in the garden. Mateo and Camilla's laughter resonated lightly, as if the storm that had shaken them was finally beginning to dissipate. That morning, Marcos and Clara attended their first couples therapy session. Sitting in the small office, sunlight filtering through the curtains, Marcos broke the silence that had accompanied him for so long. "For years I hid the truth because I was afraid," she confessed, her voice shaking. "Afraid of repeating my father's mistakes, of losing what we built together. I thought ignoring it would make it go away." Clara listened to him attentively, her hands clasped in her lap. "I made mistakes too," he replied calmly. "I let doubt consume me instead of facing things with you. But I'm here, Marcos, because I want to save what we have." The therapist smiled slightly. "Acknowledging what you feel is the first step to rebuilding trust. It won't be easy, but you're both here, and that says a lot." As she left the office, Clara felt a weight lift from her chest. She walked beside Marcos in silence, enjoying the fresh morning air. "Thank you for not giving up," Marcos murmured, gently squeezing her hand. "It's not a question of giving up," she replied calmly. "It's a question of choose use every day." That afternoon, while Clara was folding clothes in her room, she received a message from Lucia. "I arrived safely at the new apartment. Thank you for everything, Clara. You all deserve to be well, too. Marcos has a sister who loves him, and I will also learn to live with that." Clara smiled slightly. For the first time, she felt genuine respect for Lucia. That young woman had carried the weight of a secret for years, and yet she had decided to give them space to heal. Later, Marcos took the children to visit Lucia. Clara preferred to stay home, allowing that time between siblings to be hers alone. As the house fell silent, Clara went up to the attic, where she kept an old box that she hadn't opened in years. She placed it on the table and with trembling hands opened it. Inside, he found a silver pendant. He held it between his fingers, feeling the forgotten memories coming back, soft but insistent. That small object held a piece of his past, one that not even Marcos knew about. "Another day," she whispered, slamming the box shut. That night, Clara and Marcos had dinner with the children. The table was filled with laughter and anecdotes from their visit to Lucia. For the first time in weeks, calm returned to their lives. "Are we okay?" Marcos asked her in a low voice, searching her gaze. Clara smiled and took his hand. "We're starting again." As she walked upstairs later that night, Clara noticed a small envelope on her nightstand. On it, her name was written in an old, yet familiar handwriting. She looked at it with a serious expression, as if the object represented something much larger. "Tomorrow," she muttered to herself, turning off the light. Darkness enveloped the room, but this time it brought no fear. It brought the promise of a new beginning, even if the shadows of the past still waited patiently to be discovered. History teaches us that secrets, no matter how hidden they are, always find a way to come to light. Clara faced her fears and doubts to rebuild trust in her family, proving that the true, although painful, is the only path to reconciliation. And you? What would you have done if you discovered a secret that could change everything? Would you forgive or let distrust separate you from those you love the most? Click on the video that appears on the screen to continue your own self-discovery day and learn more about how to face the tests that life presents us. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and activate the bell for more stories that will inspire you to reflect and grow. See you in the next video.